My pleasure to introduce Andy Rees. So Andy's got 39 years of experience working in the environmental field, and including spending the last 23 years in the area of waste strategy. And currently Andy is head of waste strategy at the Welsh Government and is responsible for waste and circular economy strategy policy. So I think, Peter, you're going to share Andy's slides for him.
Oh, yeah.
Or I can.
Do you have them there?
Yeah, I can share them.
Yeah, you do that. You'll do it much better than me.
Well, while that's been sorted out, I'll say Pranam Dar. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Fiona and Peter, for inviting me. I suspect I've been invited really because I can give an insight into the sharp end of policy making in terms of actually driving real change. And I'll give you some examples of that, of what we've managed to achieve in Wales. So I hope you'll see by the end of it that we're practitioners in actually delivering circular economy on the ground and pulling the various levers that government can do. As Fiona said, I've been in this area for quite a while. Started in 1996 with Environment Agency Wales as their waste planner, and I was involved with the first ever National Industrial and Commercial Waste Survey, where I led the team that actually put the manual together for the survey officers. And ever since then, I've recognised the importance of waste data. But of course, waste is a measure of inefficiency, and we really need to get beyond waste. So first slide, please. Just to give you a bit of insight into devolution, because I think that was another reason why I've been asked to speak, where really what I'm saying is relevant to all four nations within the UK. Just to remind everyone that back in 1999, 22 years ago, we had devolution. So we have our own government and parliament in Wales, and we're responsible for a number of subjects, including economy, environment, which includes waste, planning, health, education, and a number of other subjects. So we have complete policy responsibility in our four parts of the UK, in the four nations, for these issues. In terms of waste, Welsh ministers have had a statutory duty to produce a waste management plan for Wales since 1999. And just remember, there is no legal requirement for any body to produce a UK waste plan. So DEFRA's Resources and Waste Plan only covers England. In terms of the requirements for a statutory waste plan for Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England, that is enshrined in legislation. And just to give you an example of some of the things that need to be included in a waste plan are the analysis of the current waste management situation. So that is details of waste produced, how it's managed, the necessary infrastructure. We have to identify our policies on waste and litter, ostensibly originally to meet the EU Waste Framework Directive policies on waste prevention, reuse, recycling, separate collection, etc. But now, of course, we need to do that anyway. Now we're outside the EU. We also have to include policies on the items shown there, so packaging waste, separate collection of waste, bio-waste, reuse, and meeting the targets that were set at the EU level, but they are now included in a modification of the Waste England and Wales regulations that I mentioned there. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of exercising our powers, just give you some examples, and I've been involved with quite a few of these on my team. My team have actually led on a number of them. So we had the Landfill Allowances scheme to meet the Article 5 of the Landfill Directive targets to divert biodegradable municipal waste from landfill. Those of you who go back as far as I will do remember the LATS scheme in England, Landfill Allowance Trading Scheme, where we decided not to have trading in Wales, and we wanted every authority to meet its share of the targets equally to divert biodegradable municipal waste from landfill. We have powers for primary legislation as well. So our first real piece of waste primary legislation, known as a measure at the time, but really it's an act, was the Waste Wales measure in 2010. And through that, we set statutory recycling targets for our local authorities, and they face a fine for failing to meet the targets. Our target for 2025 is 70% for municipal waste. Also, the Welsh Government, since day one, had a duty to promote sustainable development, but then from 2015, under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, we which is our Sustainable Development Act, that applies a sustainable development duty to the Welsh Government and the public bodies in Wales. We have to maximise our contribution to the 7 wellbeing goals and apply the 5 ways of working. Then in 2016, the Environment Wales Act Part 4 gives us a number of new powers in relation to waste, but particularly to include regulations to require the occupiers of non-domestic premises, i.e. businesses and public sector, to separate key recyclable waste at source and for them to be collected, that should be collected separately for recycling. And we're working on those regulations as we speak. Also within the UK Environment Bill, there is some incredibly important resource efficiency, circular economy powers included in there for all 4 nations ministers to use on extended producer responsibility, deposit return schemes, waste tracking, and really importantly, powers to introduce environmental product standards and environmental product labelling. In terms of fiscal instruments, we inherited the landfill disposals tax for Wales in 2018, and we're also looking to see whether it's feasible or makes sense to take over the aggregates levy for Wales. Another instrument that government uses is funding. So to help our local authorities meet their statutory recycling targets, we provided over £1 billion of extra funding to them. We also grant fund a number of bodies to help us, including Rap Cymru, Fair Share for food waste redistribution, Repair Cafe Wales, and a number of others. And last financial year, we were lucky to be able to spend £40 million on various circular economy funds targeted at the public sector, local councils, community councils, to fund reuse, repair, remanufacturing type projects across Wales, and over 180 projects were funded. Next slide, please. Just so, as a result of our ability to do our own thing and introduce our own interventions and policies and statutory targets, etc., this just shows where we are at a UK terms in terms of the 4 nations, in terms of our comparable waste from households recycling rates. We all have slightly different definitions for our targets. Just mentioned earlier, one of the difficulties, we all have a right to develop our own targets, but this has been sort of normalised against the waste from households definition from the European Union. So as you can see, we're the black bar there, so we're doing pretty well. I think Northern Ireland is also now improving, and Scotland and England are also doing their best to increase as well. As you can see, we have pretty much a head start over everybody because of all the things that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Not only are we doing, we're number 1 in the UK, but according to analysis by Eunomia, who again normalised
recording in progress,
normalised all of the figures across the world, we're actually 3rd in the world in terms of household waste recycling, closely behind Taiwan and Germany. Our ministers have an ambition for us to be 1st. Next slide, please. Just another thing that we've done in terms of transparency, obviously where our recyclate goes is very important to everyone. The public in Wales are making fantastic efforts at recycling, so we feel they have a right to know where their recyclate is going. All of the local authorities report through waste data flow, or a whole load of statistics on their municipal waste that they collect, and that includes the end destination of the recyclate. So My Recycling Wales website publishes all of that information, including the tonnages going to individual companies. And just on the right there is an example of the figures for Wales for glass, showing where they go, particularly England and Wales for glass, and some of the carbon savings achieved. And you'll see on the second in from the left there that most of our recyclate is either managed in Wales or goes to England, but of course some of that is then exported, and trying to get that accurate end destination information is a challenge, but we're working on it. Next slide, please. So in terms of all of our policies, one of the key things is to make sure that other parts of government are also helping us deliver a circular economy and resource efficiency. So circular economy is given a key feature in our statutory natural resources policy about how we manage natural resources in Wales. Circular economy in our economic action plan, it's in our low carbon delivery plan 1, and will now feature even more strongly in our new low carbon delivery plan 2 to meet our commitments for net zero for 2050, and that should be published soon. Manufacturing Action Plan has circular economy in it. Planning Policy Wales has a lot of references to a circular economy and resource efficiency approach in terms of new developments that need planning permission. Our public sector procurement policy statement, published a few months ago, also has circular economy and resource efficiency embedded in it. And our programme for government also features a drive for low carbon, green growth and a resource efficient economy. And then we just published our new circular economy strategy for Wales in March this year. Next slide, please. Just to give you a bit of oversight on how these things all fit together. I know we're not in the European Union anymore, but I've used this, I put this slide together a few years ago, drawing upon something really useful that the European Environment Agency produced. And I've mapped onto it where we are in Wales in terms of looking at waste management, waste prevention, resource efficiency, wider ecosystem resilience and human well-being. And you'll show that our various documents and approaches overlap and address all of those issues, obviously because of our sustainable development and well-being of future generations are active driver. Next slide, please. Okay, I've been trying for years to come up with a snazzy diagram to try and encompass what we're trying to do in Wales. Our circular economy strategy sets our One Planet resource use goal for 2050, using only our fair share of the Earth's resources, because it's what's fair. We have our zero waste target of 100% recycling by 2050, etc., etc. So on the left there, kind of shows 3 planets worth of resources, thick arrows moving around quickly, far too much going to landfill and to energy recovery, and using an awful lot of raw materials. On the right, a much thinner circle, thinner arrows of 1 planet's worth of resources, using far fewer raw materials, dematerializing our economy. So that shopping basket there is smaller, has fewer resources in it, and virtually zero waste to landfill and zero waste to energy recovery. I would advocate that a circular economy is merely a process, not an end outcome. You could have a circular economy and still use 3 planets worth of resources if you have uncontrolled economic growth. So we see the 1 planet resource use as the ultimate outcome, as well as net zero, etc. And circular economy is just a process to try and achieve it. After all, we've been doing circular economy since our first waste strategy in 2002, and others have been doing circular economy before that. Reduce, reuse, recycle has always been our mantra. Next slide, please. Just give you an insight into some targets. And the modelling that we did for the waste prevention targets was against ecological footprint modelling. I think John Barrett, I think you helped us on that a long time ago. So that shows what we used as an indicator. We also used life cycle assessment, obviously, to set our targets. So we've got targets for reducing avoidable food waste, recycling targets, and waste prevention targets as laid out there. But conscious of time, I won't labour them any further. Next slide, please. I'll just slow down a little bit here. I'm a bit of a waste data geek, and I've made damn sure over the years that we gather the best data possible for Wales to help inform our policies and to monitor how we're doing. As I mentioned earlier, we have very good data on local authority collected waste, collected quarterly, and that feeds into waste data flow. But importantly, the residual household waste, which tells you what you aren't recycling, and knowing what the materials are, plastic, metal, glass, etc. So we do carry out periodic compositional analyses that cost us around £500,000. We do that every 5 years, sampling each of our 22 local authorities on 2 occasions throughout sort of winter and summer, or spring and autumn, can't remember which one it is. And that's really essential data for us to map the flows of materials coming out of the local authorities, and particularly what's in the residual waste. Industrial and commercial waste, we've had various surveys done over the years. Last one commissioned for 2018, which is reasonably up to date. And again, we need to know the composition of that residual industrial and commercial waste, exactly what materials are in there. So RAP did the last analysis for us for 2018. Construction and demolition waste, I think we're unusual across the UK in actually funding actual surveys of actual construction companies. Last survey 2012, and there's now a survey that is just completed, as far as I remember, for 2019, and the data should be published early 2022. Composition of residual or mixed C&D waste, a bit more difficult. The last survey was done in 2006, so we've got a bit of a gap there. Hazardous waste arisings are gathered every quarter, I think, by Natural Resources Wales and the other environment agencies, because the hazardous waste producers have to report it. So we know a lot of detail about the fate, about the type of arisings and where they end up, whether they're recycled landfills and whether they're exported. Also, NRW get mandatory quarterly site returns from the operators of all environmental permitted facilities. I actually got all 400 waste licenses changed back in 1999 in a previous job. It was a heck of an effort to make sure that they all reported consistently in terms of the type, origin, type, quantity and origin of the waste handled in those sites. Unfortunately, packaging, weed, batteries and ELV is only reported at a UK level. So even though our ministers are democratically accountable for how those wastes are managed, at the moment we can't get that data. And we are aiming to change that through the new expanded producer responsibility regime. So the data will be reported against the 4 nations. Next slide, please. I'll speed up a bit. I did want to slow down that one. Okay, trying to put together meaningful indicators across the whole spectrum of issues in relation to circular economy, the social, environmental and economic outcomes we want, whilst also keeping a weather eye on how we're doing on waste is a challenge. Trying to get hold of some of the data is pretty difficult. Waste we're pretty good at, but other metrics are difficult. So here's a basket of indicators. I will not pretend that it's perfect, but that's what we currently have. Some of them are fairly easy for us to monitor and some are more difficult. So I'm happy to go through them in more detail if anyone wants. But you'll see there, hopefully if you can read it on screen, the sort of spectrum of the basket of indicators that we've got. Next slide, please. And the really important one here, 2 parts. We have a statutory indicator under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I think it's 46 statutory indicators covering social, economic and environmental metrics. Included is the ecological footprint there actually. But for waste, we have national indicator number 15, the amount of waste generated that is not recycled per person. So that is all of household waste, industrial, commercial and construction and demolition waste. So as you know, as I said, with some of that data we can only get every 5 years. Then really importantly, we are actively working on these following new indicators: a consumption carbon footprint, a waste carbon footprint, materials footprint, and that one planet resource use living target, and circular economy jobs. One of the biggest challenges we have as a part of the UK is having up-to-date input-output tables and knowing the flow of goods between Wales and the other parts of the UK. Our last data is 2008, so it really is pretty pointless us trying to work out these footprints without up-to-date input-output figures. So we're talking to our statistics team in Welsh Government and to others to try and get that data updated. Our targets for net zero and enshrined in the Environment Wales Act are for direct territorial emissions only. Of course, we need to address our consumption targets, and we are required to publish our consumption-based carbon footprint. So I think that's at the end of 22 or early 2023. So we're working with our decarb team on that, because obviously embedded carbon in materials is really important. Waste carbon footprint really needs a pretty good handle on the composition of residual waste to know what the embedded carbon is in those materials, hence the need for those compositional analyses. Materials footprint, as I said, is limited by the input-output table, lack of information. But what is a one planet living target for Wales? How many tonnes per person actually is it? Because we need to take into account what the population will be in 2050. It is our view that everyone across the world has an equal right to be as affluent and live as good a life as we do, but we do not have 3 planets worth of resources. So we want to do our bit, working with everyone else on dematerialising our economy and we need to be able to monitor that. Circular economy jobs. What is a circular economy job? How do you measure it? We have an example that, let's say, UPM, who take on 100% recycled content in their newsprint mill. They're not down in the SIC as a recycling company, they're down as a paper manufacturing company. So how do we identify those hundreds of jobs as circular economy jobs? Next slide, please. So finally, hopefully that gives you a very, very quick insight of what we're trying to do at the sharp end. I won't pretend it's perfect. We very much value the work that academics, consultants, RAP and others do. But just to please remember, there is no such thing as UK waste policy, UK environment policy, etc. As you all know from COVID and health, we have our own policies on those devolved subjects. So if you only want to work for England, fine, but we're quite keen that you also help us too. And I'm sure my Scottish and Northern Ireland colleagues will feel the same. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Andy. It's fantastic to see all the progress that's being made in Wales, and that the ambition is still as high as ever. And also for anyone who wants to find out more about what is happening in Wales, we're going to hear from Andy and others from different organisations across Wales and academics as well next Wednesday throughout the Circular Revolution conference. So I'll post a link to that for anyone who's interested. So we've got loads of comments and questions in the chat, and I think some of these we're going to have to pick up after the break in the general kind of discussion, but I'll try and pick up a couple of them now. So you kicked off a bit of a discussion on extended producer responsibility, Andy, in I think during Raymond's talk, and yeah, lots of agreement with that. And also Catherine highlights tax on virgin resources. So just wondered if you could say a bit about that.
Funnily enough, I'm a great fan of the Club of Rome books going back into the 1990s. So Factor 4, Limits to Growth, etc. They advocate resource taxes. So they make the comment that at the moment we tax a good, which is employment, and we don't tax a bad, which is actually the unsustainable use of resources. So they advocate that we should switch the tax system away to taxing a bad, i.e. taxing resources, and then reduce the taxes on employment, which we actually want to encourage. The aggregates levy is actually a really good example of that. And I may be wrong, but I think the UK has been a bit of a world leader in terms of having a resource tax. I'm sure academics on the call will correct me if I'm wrong there. But you know, trying to do that is obviously something Wales can't do on its own. It has to be either done at a UK level or a European level or an OECD level to really make it happen. Another way, of course, is to set strict environmental standards for what we import and procure. So setting an embedded carbon standard in products that certainly that are sold across the UK or that are procured by the public sector would have an equally dramatic effect. So there are a number of different levers that could be pulled on that. You could have a materials footprint for products as well as a carbon footprint, water footprint, social impact footprint, maybe. But good question.
Great, thank you. And I think there's a lot of people in favour of moving away from tax on labour towards tax of resources, and particularly linked to the circular skills and jobs agenda as well. And then a question from Katie. So she asked, with devolution in mind, in your opinion, Andy, what are the top do's and don'ts we should follow to ensure that policies and methods are created to work towards implementing a circular economy in the UK overall, as well as in the devolved nations?
Okay, yeah, another point I should make, because I was severely challenged on this in one of your previous sessions a few weeks ago. Of course, where it makes sense, we need to work collaboratively at a UK level, you know, respecting and remembering that businesses work across, obviously, the full UK boundaries. But, you know, we reserve the right where we feel it's really important for Wales and the Welsh people, you know, to move ahead more quickly, or differently, where it's feasible. But because, as I said, everything we do in terms of economy and waste is devolved. If you only speak to DEFRA or BEIS, you're only talking about England. So, as far as possible, staff resources permitting, if you could try and include us in your conversations, or at least allow us to have an input at some point, then what you're doing will help all 4 nations in the UK and not just one of them, to be absolutely blunt. But as it's hard for people based in London to realise that there are 3, to be frank, that there are 3 other nations doing things a bit differently. But I think anyone who's travelled across boundaries during the pandemic will have realised there are 4 different nations doing things differently. But I understand the challenge in terms of trying to get your head round the differences between the 4 administrations. But we just have got to try and work together in harmony to try and reflect that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some of the NICER programme provides a significant opportunity for doing that. And I think hopefully the policy cluster that we've developed is starting to facilitate some of that. But yeah, still a big challenge. So we're going to have a break. So I'm just going to ask one last question that comes from Melissa. So she says that Scotland had the target of reusing or recycling 70% of household waste in the circular economy strategy in 2015 by 2020, but failed. How do the targets and results of Wales compare to that, and why?
Yeah, okay. Well, I did kind of allude to that in my presentation, but we did 2 things. We set statutory recycling targets. So we're the only nation in the UK to do that. We provided £1 billion extra handed out evenly to our local authorities according to the standard spending assessment. And we also funded back in the mid-2000s, and we've done a bit more, a £3 million a public awareness campaign. It's Our Future, Don't Throw It Away, using child actors, which really resonated with the public. And the public do it entirely voluntarily, and they've been absolutely fantastic at recycling. And I think any of you who ever come to Wales for holiday, hopefully will visit friends or relatives, will see how committed most of our public are. And there are still some who we need to work on. So behavioural insights and behaviour change is a key part of the work that RAP support us on. But that's really why we've done it. And we do share these experiences with the other 3 administrations. But of course, we have a different political makeup and different political sensitivities across the 4 nations as to what isn't practical to actually do.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much.